May 5th, 1945. The sound of artillery echoed across the Austrian Alps as dawn broke over one of the most surreal battlefields in human history. American tanks rolled through mountain passes alongside Wehrmacht soldiers. French resistance fighters checked their weapons next to SS officers who had abandoned their posts, and at the centre of it all stood a medieval castle that would witness the most unlikely alliance of World War II. This is the story of the Battle of Castle Itter, where enemies became brothers in arms for 13 hours that defied every rule of warfare, where former French prime ministers fought beside American tank crews, where German soldiers made their final stand not for the Reich, but against it, and where the last battle fought on European soil during World War II became the strangest chapter in military history. But to understand how this impossible alliance came to be, we need to travel back to a different kind of prison, one where the powerful had become powerless, and where desperation would forge the most unexpected bonds. Castle Itter perched on its rocky outcrop like something from a dark fairy tale. Built in 1241, this fortress had watched centuries of conflict sweep across the Tyrolean valleys below. But by 1943, it had been transformed into something far more sinister than its medieval builders could have ever imagined. The SS had converted the ancient stronghold into a prison for what they called prominente, high-value prisoners whose names could move nations. Inside these stone walls, former French Prime Minister Edouard Daladier paced his cell. The man who had signed the Munich Agreement now found himself trapped in the very heart of the Nazi empire he had tried to appease. His footsteps echoed off walls that had once housed Austrian nobles, but now confined the architects of French resistance to Hitler's advance. Down the corridor, Paul Renault sat in contemplation. The Prime Minister who had refused Hitler's demands and declared war on Germany now stared through barred windows at the Alps where his countrymen fought and died. These weren't ordinary prisoners of war. These were the men whose decisions had shaped the conflict-consuming Europe, now reduced to counting days in medieval chambers. But perhaps the most intriguing prisoner was Jean Borotra, the legendary tennis champion known as the Bounding Basque. His athletic fame had made him a symbol of French excellence before the war, and his presence in Castle Itter spoke to the Nazi obsession with capturing not just political leaders, but cultural icons who embodied national spirit. The castle's Austrian staff watched these powerful men with a mixture of fascination and pity. Stefan Gutmann, the prison administrator, had initially embraced his role as keeper of France's fallen elite. But as months turned to years, and as reports from the fronts grew increasingly desperate for Germany, even he began to question the purpose of holding these men in their mountain fortress. The prisoners themselves had formed an unlikely community. Former political rivals found themselves sharing meals and conversation. Men who had spent careers fighting each other now discovered common ground in their shared captivity. Daladier and Renault, whose political differences had once paralysed French government, now played chess together in the castle's great hall. Yet beneath this forced civility lay a growing tension. Radio broadcasts smuggled in by sympathetic guards brought news of Allied advances, the Normandy landings, the liberation of Paris, the crossing of the Rhine. Each victory brought hope of rescue, but also fear of what their SS captors might do as the Reich crumbled around them. By early 1945, the situation had become precarious. Castle Itter existed in a strange bubble, isolated from the chaos consuming the Third Reich. The prisoners knew that somewhere beyond these walls Germany was collapsing, but they also knew that desperate men do desperate things, and their value as bargaining chips might be their salvation or their death sentence. The castle's commander, Sebastian Wimmer, found himself in an impossible position. A career SS officer, he had followed orders without question for years. But as reports arrived of concentration camps being overrun and war crimes being exposed, he began to understand that his service to the Reich had made him complicit in horrors beyond imagination. The French politicians in his charge represented more than just prisoners now. They were witnesses to his conduct, men whose testimony could determine his fate in whatever world emerged from the war's end. Meanwhile, in the surrounding countryside, other forces were converging on the Tyrolean Alps. American armoured divisions pushed through mountain passes, encountering pockets of Wehrmacht resistance that seemed increasingly half-hearted. German soldiers, many of them veterans of brutal Eastern Front campaigns, found themselves questioning orders to fight to the death for a cause that was clearly lost. Among these German forces was Major Josef Gangl, a Wehrmacht officer whose disillusionment with the Nazi regime had grown with each passing month. Gangl had witnessed the consequences of blind obedience, had seen good soldiers die for political ambitions that served no purpose beyond prolonging inevitable defeat. As his unit retreated through the Austrian countryside, he made a decision that would place him at the centre of the most extraordinary military alliance in modern history. The Major understood something that many of his fellow officers refused to acknowledge. The war was over in all but name. The question now was not whether Germany would lose, but how many more would die before sanity prevailed. And somewhere in those calculations, Castle Itter had become a symbol of everything wrong with the conflict that had consumed his nation. As April gave way to May, the pace of events accelerated. Soviet forces were fighting street by street through Berlin. Hitler had retreated to his bunker, issuing increasingly deranged orders that his remaining generals struggled to implement. And in the Austrian Alps, a medieval castle prepared to host the final act of a war that had already claimed 50 million lives. The prisoners in Castle Itter could sense the approaching climax. Guards who had once been rigidly disciplined now whispered among themselves, their conversations filled with worry about what would happen when the Americans arrived. Some spoke of fleeing into the mountains. Others suggested that cooperating with the approaching Allied forces might offer their only chance of survival. But it was Sebastian Wimmer who understood most clearly that the old rules no longer applied. The SS officer who had spent years following orders without question now faced a choice that would define not just his own fate, but the fate of the high-value prisoners under his command. He could follow standing orders to eliminate the prisoners rather than allow them to fall into Allied hands, or he could make a decision that went against everything his training had taught him. The stage was set for 13 hours that would blur every line between friend and enemy, between collaboration and resistance, between the old world and the new in the valleys below Castle Itter. American tank crews checked their equipment and studied maps of mountain roads they had never travelled. German soldiers debated whether their oaths to the Reich still held meaning, when the Reich itself had become a hollow shell. And French prisoners who had once governed a great nation prepared to fight for their lives alongside men who had been their captors. What happened next would challenge every assumption about loyalty, duty, and the nature of warfare itself. It would prove that even in the darkest chapters of human history, men could choose to stand together against forces that threatened to destroy everything they held sacred. The Battle of Castle Itter was about to begin. About to begin. The first signs of collapse came not with dramatic pronouncements, but with small acts of rebellion that rippled through the castle's ancient corridors. On the morning of May 2nd, a guard named Andreas Krobot made a decision that would echo through history. Instead of delivering the prisoners their usual meagre breakfast rations, he brought them news from the outside world. The Americans were less than 50 kilometers away. Hitler was dead. The Reich that had seemed eternal just years before was breathing its final breaths. Krobot's whispered words spread through the prisoner population like wildfire. Edouard Daladier, the man who had once commanded the respect of parliament chambers across Europe, found himself gripping the bars of his cell window with trembling hands. After 2 years of captivity, after watching seasons change from these same stone walls, liberation seemed almost too incredible to believe. Yet the evidence was mounting with each passing hour. Paul Renaud gathered the other French prisoners in the castle's common area, his voice carrying the authority that had once addressed the French nation. During its darkest hours, they needed to prepare for what was coming, he told them. The SS would not simply open the gates and wish them well. History had shown what desperate men were capable of when cornered, and they were dealing with men who had built their careers on systematic brutality. But it was Jean Barotrat who suggested something that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. The tennis champion had spent his athletic career reading opponents, understanding when to attack and when to defend. His instincts told him that their captors were more frightened than they were. Perhaps, he proposed, it was time to stop thinking like prisoners and start thinking like the leaders they had once been. The transformation began subtly. Guards who had once barked orders now spoke in quieter tones. The rigid schedule of prison life gave way to a strange informality, as everyone waited for news that never seemed to come fast enough. Even Sebastian Wimmer, the SS commander whose word had been law within these walls, appeared uncertain about the protocols for surrendering a castle full of France's former leadership to advancing American forces. Meanwhile, 30 kilometers down the mountain, Captain Jack Lee of the 12th Armoured Division's Combat Command B studied intelligence reports that made little sense. His unit had been pushing through Austrian resistance for weeks, encountering German forces that seemed more interested in avoiding combat than engaging American armour. But the reports about Castle Itter were different. High-value prisoners, possible war criminals as guards, and a medieval fortress that could become a death trap if mishandled. Lee understood the delicate nature of what lay ahead. These weren't ordinary prisoners of war who could be processed through standard military channels. These were men whose names appeared in history books, whose decisions had shaped the conflict that had consumed his generation. Their safe recovery could influence post-war politics across Europe. Their deaths could create diplomatic crises that would outlast the war itself. But as Lee's Sherman tanks wound through Alpine roads that had never been designed for modern warfare, he received intelligence that complicated everything he thought he knew about the situation. German forces in the area weren't just retreating. Some were actively seeking contact with American units, not to surrender but to negotiate something far more complex. Major Josef Gangl had spent 3 days making his way through mountain passes with a small group of Wehrmacht soldiers who shared his growing conviction that continuing to fight served no purpose beyond adding to the war's already staggering casualty count. But Gangl wasn't simply seeking to surrender his unit. He carried information about Castle Itter that could save lives, and a proposal that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. The Major had learned through contacts in the Austrian resistance that the castle's prisoners were in immediate danger. SS units retreating through the area had received orders to eliminate high-value prisoners rather than allow them to provide testimony about war crimes. Gangl knew the terrain around Castle Itter, knew the defensive positions that would need to be overcome, and knew that time was running out. His proposal was as simple as it was revolutionary. German forces under his command would assist American troops in securing the castle and protecting the French prisoners. Wehrmacht soldiers would fight alongside the men they had been trained to consider enemies, united by a common goal that transcended the political divisions that had created the war. When Gangl's message reached Captain Lee through Austrian resistance channels, the American officer found himself facing a decision that his military training had never prepared him for. Accepting help from German forces could be seen as collaboration with the enemy, but refusing might result in the deaths of prisoners whose safe recovery was now a strategic priority for Allied command. The captain studied his maps one more time, calculating distances and defensive positions. Castle Itter sat on high ground that would be difficult to assault directly. The approach roads were narrow and exposed, perfect terrain for defenders who knew how to use the natural advantages. A frontal assault could succeed, but it would likely result in casualties among both his men and the prisoners they were trying to rescue. Lee made his choice. He would meet with Major Gangl and evaluate the German officer's proposal. If the Wehrmacht soldiers proved trustworthy, if their intelligence about the castle proved accurate, then perhaps this war could end with an act of cooperation rather than another bloody battle between forces that had already sacrificed too much. The meeting took place in a small Austrian village that had changed hands 3 times in the past week. Lee arrived with a small escort, his hand never far from his sidearm as he studied the German major who had requested this unprecedented conference. Gangl appeared to be everything intelligence reports had suggested, a professional soldier whose loyalty to his country had survived the collapse of his government. Through halting English and borrowed German phrases, the 2 officers outlined a plan that would have seemed like fantasy just months earlier. American armour would provide heavy support, while German infantry, who knew the local terrain intimately, would guide the assault on defensive positions they had helped establish. The French prisoners would be protected by the same men who had once been responsible for their captivity. But even as they spoke, both officers understood that the greatest challenge would not be tactical. It would be convincing their respective forces to fight alongside men they had been trained to kill. American soldiers who had lost friends to German bullets would now depend on Wehrmacht guidance. German troops who had spent years retreating from American advances would now stand shoulder to shoulder with Sherman tank crews. The alliance that emerged from that village meeting was born of necessity, but it represented something larger than military expediency. It was a recognition that some principles transcended the artificial divisions created by politics and propaganda. The protection of innocent lives, the rejection of pointless cruelty, the understanding that wars must end with honour intact on all sides. As darkness fell on May 4th, the most unlikely military force in modern history began its approach to Castle Itter. American tanks rolled through mountain passes guided by German infantry scouts. French prisoners prepared to fight for their own liberation alongside their former captors. And in the castle above, Sebastian Wimmer made final preparations for a battle that would determine whether this war ended with one last act of senseless violence or with proof that even enemies could choose to become something better. The castle's ancient stones had witnessed 7 centuries of conflict, but nothing had prepared them for what unfolded in the pre-dawn hours of May 5th, 1945. In the courtyard where medieval knights had once prepared for battle, French politicians now checked makeshift weapons alongside German guards who had made the most dangerous decision of their lives. The transformation was complete. Prison had become fortress, captors had become allies, and enemies had found common cause in the face of approaching madness. Sebastian Wimmer stood at the castle's highest window, watching American headlights wind through the valley below like fireflies in the darkness. The SS officer, who had once enforced Hitler's will with unquestioning loyalty, now faced a choice that would define the rest of his life. Behind him, the French prisoners he had guarded for 2 years prepared for battle. Ahead of him, his own SS superiors approached with orders to eliminate every witness to their crimes. The irony was not lost on any of them. Edouard Daladier, the man who had tried to prevent this war through appeasement, now prepared to fight harder than he ever had as a free man. Paul Renault, who had declared war on Germany from the halls of French government, now stood ready to die beside German soldiers who had abandoned their post to protect him. History was writing itself in ways that no strategist could have predicted. At 0430 hours, the first shots echoed across the Alpine Valley, not the coordinated barrage of a planned assault, but the scattered firing of desperate men who understood that surrender meant facing judgment for crimes that had no statute of limitations. SS units approaching from 3 directions had received their final orders. No prisoners were to survive, no witnesses could remain. Castle Itter was to become a tomb. Major Josef Gangl crouched behind an overturned supply cart in the castle's lower bailey, his Wehrmacht uniform making him a target for both sides in this impossible conflict. The irony of his position was almost overwhelming. German soldiers who followed their orders would shoot him as a traitor. American forces who didn't understand the alliance might kill him as an enemy. His only protection came from French prisoners who had every reason to hate everything he represented. But war creates its own logic, and survival demands pragmatism that peacetime minds struggle to comprehend. When the first SS assault team breached the castle's outer defences, political differences evaporated in the face of immediate danger. Daladier and Renault, men whose political feuds had paralysed French government, now coordinated defensive positions with the efficiency of professional soldiers. Jean Borotra moved through the castle's corridors with the same athletic grace that had made him a tennis legend. But instead of pursuing championship points, he now carried ammunition to defenders who held the line against former comrades turned executioners. The bounding Basque had found a game where losing meant death not just for himself, but for men who had become unlikely brothers in these final hours of European warfare. Captain Jack Lee's Sherman tank crested the final ridge as dawn painted the Alpine peaks in shades of gold and crimson. Below him, Castle Itter rose from its rocky perch like something from a fever dream. Muzzle flashes sparked from medieval battlements, while tracer rounds arced between stone towers that had watched centuries of human conflict. This was not the war he had trained for, not the enemy he had prepared to fight. Through his radio crackle reports that defied military logic, German infantry was requesting American artillery support against SS positions. French civilians were manning machine guns alongside Wehrmacht veterans. The battle lines that had defined 4 years of global conflict had dissolved into something entirely unprecedented in military history. Lee's tank destroyer crews had positioned themselves on overlooks that provided clear fields of fire into the valley, but identifying targets proved almost impossible. Friend and foe wore the same uniforms, spoke the same language, carried the same weapons. Only their actions revealed their allegiances, and in the chaos of close-quarters combat, even that distinction became dangerously unclear. Inside the castle, Sebastian Wimmer faced the ultimate test of his newfound convictions. Through the Great Hall's windows he could see SS troops advancing under cover of early morning mist. These were his former comrades, men with whom he had served throughout the war's darkest chapters. They expected his cooperation, expected him to deliver the French prisoners as ordered instead. Wimmer did something that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. He opened the castle's armoury to the very men he'd been ordered to execute. French politicians who had spent 2 years as helpless prisoners now armed themselves with German weapons. preparing to fight for their lives alongside their former captors. The psychological transformation was as remarkable as the tactical situation. Paul Renault, who had once commanded the resources of a great nation, now found himself checking the ammunition in a captured machine pistol. The weight of the weapon in his hands represented more than just firepower. It represented agency, the power to determine his own fate, rather than simply waiting for others to decide whether he lived or died. Edouard Daladier positioned himself at a window overlooking the castle's main approach. His political instincts now focused on reading terrain rather than parliament chambers. The man who had signed the Munich Agreement, who had tried to preserve peace through compromise, now prepared to fight with a determination that had been absent from his pre-war diplomacy. But it was the German guards who faced the most complex emotional challenge. Men like Andreas Krobot had spent years following orders without question, maintaining discipline that defined their professional identity. Now they found themselves shooting at uniforms identical to their own, defending prisoners they had been trained to guard against escape. The battle intensified as SS assault teams reached the castle's outer walls. These were not the demoralized conscripts that American forces had been encountering throughout their advance. These were hardened veterans who understood that failure meant facing war crimes, tribunals that would show no mercy to men who had built their careers on systematic brutality. Their desperation made them dangerous in ways that conventional military opponents could never match. They fought with the fury of cornered animals, knowing that surrender offered no hope of survival. Every window, every doorway, every stone staircase became a potential killing ground, where men who had once shared the same cause now fought to the death. Major Gangle found himself in a position that no military academy had prepared him for. His tactical knowledge of the castle's defences now served to protect the very prisoners those defences had been designed to contain. He guided American artillery strikes against positions he had helped establish, turned German defensive doctrine against German forces who still believed in the Reich's ultimate victory. The Major's transformation represented something larger than personal redemption. It embodied the possibility that even in war's darkest chapters, individuals could choose principles over politics, humanity over ideology. His presence on the castle's ramparts, fighting beside French resistance leaders and American tank crews, proved that the bonds forged in combat could transcend the artificial divisions created by governments and propaganda. As morning light strengthened, the true scope of the battle became clear. This was not simply a rescue mission or a prison break. It was the final confrontation between two competing visions of what Europe could become. On one side stood those who believed that might made right, that superior force justified any action, that loyalty to abstract ideals mattered more than human lives. On the other side fought an alliance that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. Americans and Germans, former prime ministers and common soldiers, professional officers and political prisoners, all united by the understanding that some principles transcended the accidents of nationality and circumstance. The battle raged through corridors where medieval lords had once plotted conquest, now echoing with the sounds of modern warfare fought for ancient concepts of honour and protection. Castle Itter had become a crucible where the war's true meaning would be decided not by grand strategy or political manoeuvring, but by individual choices made under the ultimate pressure of life and death. The guns fell silent at 16:47 hours on May 5, 1945. Castle Itter stood scarred but unbroken, its ancient stones bearing witness to 13 hours that rewrote the rules of warfare every French prisoner survived. Major Gangle died a hero, struck down while defending men who had once been his enemies. And in those final moments of the European war, enemies had proven that humanity could triumph over ideology, that courage could unite those whom politics had divided, forever changing how we understand the true meaning of honour in warfare.